The lesson.
Oh, yeah.
As you are catching on to the Australian stuff, and obviously that's off the back of being introduced to the American stuff, at this point in time, you're already writing for these magazines, or you haven't started writing for magazines yet?
Nah, I was still in high school then. It was probably about 5 years later that I started doing the journalism stuff. Yeah, so 2000, the Aussie stuff was probably like when I was like, 14, 15, 16, and then I didn't start writing till I was about 2021, and then properly in like when I was like 22. So yeah, it's probably like a good 5-6 year gap there, yeah.
Okay, so by the time you've started writing, you're already into Australian rap, but the first things that you started writing about were not Australian rap.
No, it wasn't. I mean, I always supported like the One Day Boys and stuff. Outside of LC and stuff, like the underground, I wasn't, like I knew Fort and Curse obviously like around that time, but, and all the Hustle Hard artists, but it was more kind of like American stuff purely because like, back then I was still doing it for fun. When I first started, I got a job and stuff, but it wasn't like that serious. And I had a friend who, she actually did the PR for most of the rappers that came to Australia. So back then, being 20 years old or whatever, and, you're getting a chance to interview, Craig David or, or like just, just like A$AP Ferg, like the most ridiculous artists. And it's just like more for me, it was just like fun because I get to meet my heroes. I met The Game, like Fat Joe. I got to chop it up with him about DITC, you know what I mean? It's just like childhood type stuff. And it was like more, I was doing it just, it was a part-time job, a bit of spare money. I was still working in retail, a bit of spare money. And it's like, I get to meet my heroes and that's kind of it. There was no like, it's not like now where I have kind of like a clear vision of like what that could actually entail, like doing the interviews and stuff and kind of bringing up the scene. It was never viewed like that back then. It was more just like, oh, cool. I get free tickets to gigs. I get to meet the guys I grew up listening to and have a bit of fun and make a bit of money. And that was it. So I was never really focused that much on the Australian stuff in the early days, besides like, doing stuff with the One Day Boys and stuff just because they were mates and, they were throwing mad parties back then and doing whatever. So yeah, it wasn't really until a couple of years later that I really started honing in the Australian scene and really trying to, I guess, elevate the scene in a sense. Yeah, that was probably around 2016. I started really focusing on the Australian stuff, yeah.
So now, in those first couple of years before you started focusing on the Australian stuff, you mentioned some of the names that you got to interview, and like I've got a few names here. It says you interviewed Kendrick Lamar in 2012, Kim Kardashian in 2014, as well as A$AP Ferg, DJ Khaled, and Ice Cube.
Yeah, Ice Cube, yeah.
And his son, O'Shea Jackson Jr. You mentioned Fat Joe, and there's obviously probably a bunch of guys that I'm missing out. Now, one of the big ones that stood out for me was Kim Kardashian. Because she's not a musician, but it's a very, very big celebrity name. How did that come about, and can you recall what that experience was like at that time?
Yeah, so the whole Kim thing came about because, so back when I first started writing as well, it was kind of 50-50 what I was doing. I was doing 50% music, but I was doing a lot of fashion and stuff. And back then, sneaker culture was kind of blowing up and yada, yada, yada. So basically, I was in touch with like a lot of the fashion publicists at the time. And one of the PR agencies, they look after a bunch of stuff like, big fashion brands or whatever. They were doing PR for Kim Kardashian's fashion line, which she was launching at the time. So they sent an email over to us saying, hey, Kim Kardashian is doing a in-store appearance at Parramatta Westfields. Can you do an article about it and, generate some publicity or whatever? I was like, yeah, sweet. Just did it. Sent the article back to him. And I just said, as like kind of like an off comment, I was like, if she has any time on ground, like, let me know. And they were like, yeah, we'll let you know. And, literally didn't think anything of it. A couple of days later, my boss texted me and said, check your emails. I checked my email and they said in there, oh, you have been approved for a 5-minute interview with Kim Kardashian. And I was like, you're fucking joking me. Like, you know what I mean? Like what you, yeah, 2014. So I was like, yeah, like 24 years old, like barely knew what I was doing. Like went to the Park Hyatt Hotel, which is like a 5-star hotel under the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Walked in there, like security, got frisked 3 times, like metal detected. Walked in this room and, you know, it's like a full glitzy room. And she just comes and sits down like literally 1 meter away from me. And I was just like, what the fuck? This is so weird, eh? And obviously, because it's like a big celebrity, I had to flag all the questions with a publicist. And then, so I couldn't ask anything really that off topic or anything like that. It was more just about her fashion line. And she told me she had 3 Gucci visors. I was like, that's cool. Like, she told me a couple of other things. Finished the interview and then, got a photo with her, which is still on my Insta. People think I photoshopped that photo. I'm like, nah, it's 100% real. It was just taken on like an iPhone 2 or whatever was out in 2014, an iPhone 3 or whatever. So it's not that clear, but it's definitely me and her. And then she was really nice. She was sweet, very articulate, knows what she's doing. She's switched on. Yeah, she was really cool. Like I said this before actually on the internet. Like I've met Sydney rappers who have a bigger ego than her. You know, like she was just straight up. She was cool. Yeah, and then finished the interview, and then that night went and saw Kanye. I think it was at the Sydney Entertainment Centre, which doesn't exist anymore, but I'm pretty sure he played there. And then she was up in the stands, and he was there for the Yeezus tour, and he played all the bangers off there. He played Black Skinhead, Blood on the Leaves, some older stuff, and it's just a crazy, crazy day. And I think in those early days, like that's kind of what kept me going, you know, like just getting to do really cool shit. Like I said, like the plan was to kind of quit. When I turned 25 or whatever and kind of do a serious job or whatever. So those were kind of like my last years of having fun before I went to a serious job. So I was just doing funny shit. And then, 8 years later, here we are. So.
And another big one that was very impressive that I didn't know about is before the Kim Kardashian interview, you interviewed Kendrick Lamar in 2012. Now, Kendrick in 2012, I mean, you would have been obviously relatively young, and he was just, from memory, it's around then when he was just starting to pop. Again, how did that come about, and how was that experience for you at that particular point in time?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So that happened because, back then there wasn't, nowadays it's like there's so many voices in the hip hop media space. Like so many people have podcasts or blogs or whatever. Like back then it was a lot different. Like the scene was a lot different. And I guess there was only like really a handful of writers that were doing that stuff really. And as soon as I established those relationships with like the labels or the publicists, it was kind of easy for me to get a lot of those interviews, to be honest. So back then, my friend Katie, she works at Apple now, but she was one of the head publicists at Universal. And I remember she told me, hey, we have 3 interview slots for Kendrick when he comes to Sydney. Do you want one? And this was when he was touring Australia just straight off the back of Good Kid. So he had Section 80. Good Kid had just dropped. And then when it dropped, it obviously went crazy. And they upgraded the Sydney show from the Metro Theatre to the Enmore Theatre, sold out straight away. So there was like so much hype behind it. And I remember just being like, fuck, this is cool. But obviously like back then I had no idea of how much of an influential legacy artist Kendrick was going to be. Like, you know, he'd released a mad EP and he now just dropped like an amazing album. I think back then like The Game and Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre, they were kind of like doing a passing the torch thing to Kendrick at the time. It was kind of like, you know, all the West Coast legends were kind of being like, you know, he's next up. But obviously he wasn't like as solidified or as like immortal as he is nowadays, you know? So I was still going into it like kind of like, oh yeah, this is cool. Like, you know, he's an upcoming artist. It's exciting, yada, yada, yada. He was staying at the Hilton on George Street, just up from Town Hall in Sydney. And I remember we walked in the hotel lobby and met Katie, my friend, she was there. And she's like, oh, Kendrick's coming down. And I was like, okay, cool. And he kind of came downstairs just in like sweatpants and was just like, hey. And I was like, oh, fuck, hey, like, how you doing? Like, so weird. Like, just in the middle of the Hilton, like with all these people around everywhere. And then we were kind of like, oh, where are we going to do the interview? And he was like, oh, let's just go back up to my hotel room. It's quiet there. And I was like, all right, sweet. So me, Katie, one of my friends came, his manager. We all were just going up in this lift, and it was going up to like the 35th floor or something ridiculous, and it was just like dead quiet in the lift. I was like, this is so fucking awkward. But then when we started the interview, it was mad. Like, you know, obviously Good Kid being such a, still, you know, my favorite Kendrick album to this day, being such an amazing album. There's a lot to talk about. He was really generous with his time, generous with his energy. Yeah, it's just really cool, man. It's just really another one of the moments I look back on. And then I remember after the interview, I asked him, can I get a photo? And he was like, yeah, of course. And then I remember his manager went to take the photo, but he couldn't figure out how to open the blinds. And then the lighting, he was like, no, the lighting's bad. We have to open the blinds. And he was figuring out how to press it, but then couldn't figure out how to open it. And then he turned on the light, and then he jumped on the bed, and then he was taking photos from like all different angles. And like, he was like, oh, is that one good enough? And I'm like, yeah, it's cool. And then I remember I was with a friend, and then I was kind of like, oh, do you want to get a photo with Kendrick as well? And she was like, because she came straight from work, and she was like, no, I don't have any makeup on. I look shit. Like, I don't want to get it. And obviously now, like, she's like spewing, because it's like, fuck, you know, he's a legend, like a living legend, you know, arguably the best rapper in the world. And she's spewing she never took that chance to get a photo with Kendrick. But yeah, it's another one of them moments you look back on. I actually interviewed him 2 years after that, on the phone though. He had a deal with Reebok. It was his deal before Nike. He had the Reeboks that had red on one shoe and blue on one shoe. And then yeah, I interviewed him for that. But the first one was definitely the craziest one. Oh, and I remember the last question I asked him. I don't know why I asked this. Out of all the questions I could ask, the last question I asked him, I was like, oh, are you going to play Fucking Problems? Which was A$AP Rocky's track that featured him and 2 Chainz and Drake. And I was like, are you going to play Fucking Problems? And he was like, at the show tonight? And he was like, we'll see. And then I went to the show at the Enmore, and he actually played it. And, you know, in my mind, like, if I'm going to, you know, be a bit self-absorbed here, he played it because I asked him to, you know.
The lesson. 927. Oh, yeah.